be another week actually to prepare some. I have so many slides I want to share with you. Um, I can always use the time to make a selection. Okay, so this is the module metabolic lab. Do we agree?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, good. Okay, fine. Okay. Well, Longo and Monteville are the main readings there. And maybe one way to think about this is, let me go back to the module for that. And open it again, number 6, and the questions. Okay, because this thing about the questions I'm asking for this week, for this unit, have to do with, finding, just like before, trying to come up with some characteristics of metabolic systems that we can carry forward from what we know to be living, like the cells, but to carry them forward when we go back to look at infrastructures, all right? So that's why we're doing this exercise. So if we go back to the readings here, okay, and that may be, well, it would be a nice attitude to have when you go back to the readings, because the readings, of course, are very scientific, all right? That's why this verbal discussion is so important, because the scientific work is extremely, mathematical. So let me go back to just look at each other. Whereas in autopoiesis, the Maturana and Vermeer work, they had just in one paragraph a description of what constitutes a multipoietic system. And to recap, because I know this came up in people's responses, kind of the starting point for that kind of analysis is first think about what the system is. Right? So that system has a bunch of parts, components, right? And then just think of the body. So there are organs, and then there are connections, relations between the components. And then there's stuff flowing from component to component. So blood, lymph, banking system. What's the flow between in a banking system? Just the flow between parts. What's the main thing that flows? The financial system, money. Okay. In the case of computer network, what is it? Computer network.
Information.
Information. And then at the bottom of the information is data. Okay, just data packets. Okay. So I'm asking these kinds of questions also as a methodology, because when we ask these kinds of questions, let's start with the most obvious answer. Okay, so then we'll jazz it up. Okay, so don't be afraid to start with extremely basic, what might seem even like obvious answers to these kinds of questions, because that's the only way we can understand the theory. So then when we go up to the Maturana and Varela, they talk about processes of self-reproducible parts. Okay, it sounds very abstract until you think about something very basic like my lungs and heart. Okay, or they talk about invariances, invariant relationships among processes. Well, think about it in terms of the bank. If there's a run on one bank, some other banks in the system have to go make up the cash. And if they start filling, then the Federal Reserve steps in, and the Federal Reserve starts to, get shaky, the federal government comes in. Which is what's happened several times, right? To avoid another Great Depression. So that means the whole system, if it's truly autopoietic, has to be able to maintain invariantly relationships among the parts, like this regional banks, the national banks, Federal Reserve, etc. Right? So that's the kind of thing we like to carry forward when we go later on to look at case studies. Okay. Okay. Now let's go to metabolic. So for Longo and Monteville, they have a bunch of different ways to distinguish between physical systems, what physics applies to, and biological systems. And here, I wonder if maybe some of you who've looked into the readings can pick out some of those distinctions. And meantime, I'll also go look. Okay, I'll also go start digging into it right now. So let's take a look.
So one of the things they said was that the physical systems are invariant. They're objects that can be substituted in for each other, but the living systems, they're individuated, right? So that individuals within the system are not substitutable for each other.
Yeah, and then maybe we can come up with examples from each, from the physics side and from the biology side. From the physics side, when we say that two individuals means like two particles, right? Like two electrons, two protons, two neutrons, right?
Right.
Substitutable means, well, you take one electron over here, and then have another electron over here, and just swap them. But the same physics goes on. I mean, the current in this part is the same as the current over here, right? I mean, two particles, actually by definition in physics, are exchangeable. They're indiscernible. Okay, absolutely. I mean, mathematically, they're identical even. And that's not true, right? For any living being. Even if you're two genetically identical clones, we know that, right? They just don't grow the same way. That's absolutely the case. Why? Okay, let me ask you, why is it the case that two organisms are never the same, even if they're genetically identical? What do you think?
I mean, there isn't a one-to-one relationship between the genetics and the phenotypic expression or other types of factors that shape the expression of the genes. So there's like genetic factors, environmental factors.
And do you know
That's
the
one.
scientific? Yeah, that's key. What Cameron is saying. And what's the what do you know the name for that expressed set of features of an organism? There's a scientific word for that.
The phenotype.
Yeah. So we have the genotype, which is exactly. Oh yeah, and then the larger part is epigenetic. So to put them all together, what Cameron and Tanya are saying, to refresh that, to recap that, we have the genotype. You know what the genes we inherit, but then the phenotype is the actual proteins, the actual muscles and tissues, and what is actually instantiated as we mature as an organism, right? And then I'm going to give the baton to Tanya in just a minute. This is in the growth of one single organism, okay, from the egg up. But then over generations, right, we do pass on our genes, right? But then I think I heard Tanya, you say epigenetics. So one can say you can track the genetic lineage, but there's all this other stuff going on. So what does epigenetics refer to?
So it's the ways that the environment that the organism is in changes the genetic expression and actually does change how that is transferred, right? So I mean, I have examples I can think of, like
Right.
they did experiments on on basically rodents, mice or rats, I don't know, but they live placing them in a state of deprivation, like hunger, created certain types of gene expressions that were actually then, so like their offspring stored calories differently and had a propensity towards obesity than in an environment, right? But it wasn't just their DNA, it came from this like these things that got turned on by the deprivation of their grandparents or whatever.
And you think about what we're hearing here, right? That means it's environment. It's the environment. I mean, ordinarily we say, oh yeah, no big deal. I mean, the environment obviously should have an effect on me as an individual organism as I grow up, right? So, but what's really powerful about what we're hearing right there is that environment also affects the traits that offspring have in the next generations. I mean, okay, I'm a different generation from you, right? But when I was learning biology in school, like in grade school, high school, I was told genes is everything. So that means the environment would not have any impact, any say in the traits that the offspring have, you know. But then I also remember going to school and hearing back in the day that what number, I don't remember the percentages, but some shockingly high percentage of the genes in the human genome were called silent. They were called silent genes, meaning nobody knew what they were for, but they were there. And this epigenetic stuff was a giant revolution. I'll tell you, I mean, even in grad school, which is of course a long time ago, in San Francisco, there was a big research center for studying alcoholism, genetic correlates to alcoholism. Well, they would say causes, genetic causes for alcoholism, because I mean there are a lot of and it was in the center of the city, right where there was a lot of tenderloin, where a lot of homeless people were drinking out of bottles out of brown paper bags, right? And guess who was sponsoring that research center? Have you heard of Gallo wine? It makes rock gut. I mean, it's one of the biggest makers of of the kind of the cheap gallon by the gallon alcohol that you buy if you can't afford to buy anything else. So I thought it was pretty ironic, or actually very very unsurprising, that Gallo wine would actually sponsor a center for looking for genetic markers for alcoholism. So you can say it's not my fault; it's their fault, right? But the silent genes, about 15 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, there were some massive studies done by teams of about 300 scientists who are finally to crack the nut on this thing. What are they for? And they discovered through a lot of different kinds of experiments, there's a major set of works that there are these switches, that a lot of these genes that were thought of as silent, they actually don't code for traits, they code for expression. I mean, they respond to changes in the environment and modulate the expression of the trait bearing parts of the genotype. So it switches. So right away, bang! It tells you that that's how. I mean, that's how the organism actually can regulate and respond to variations in the environment. How the organism then expresses or actualizes certain kinds of potential traits that's carrying this genotype. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. I don't know. Does anybody know offhand like the percentages? I mean, I know it's a massive percentage that's switching. It's very large. We can look it up later, okay? I don't know, like 80-20, 70-30, 90-10. I mean, it's massive. So what does that tell you if the quote silent part is so massive versus the coding part? What do you think?
I'm not sure if this is what you're getting at, but just that we have a really insane capacity to respond to environmental changes.
And then reciprocally, environmental changes have insanely large influence on how we get expressed, or just extraordinarily large. This goes both ways. Okay. So the old nature nurture debate, which is more important, that's just gone. It's both. But nurture or environment is better to put it that way, is very effective. And as I'm saying these things, it might be interesting to think ahead of time, how would this get played out in terms of designing future infrastructure to be more resilient, right? I mean, right this minute, I'm completing a grant, a small grant to help NGO decision makers and policymakers and citizens in civil agencies, government agencies, NGOs, to prepare themselves to work together in the face of radical indeterminism, like war in Ukraine, COVID, what have you, where these kind of what are called black swan, is that what it is? Black swan events are kind of rare. People think of kind of one-of-a-kind events are not rare. And unknown unknowns are always there, are endemic, and planning doesn't help. I mean, planning is necessary, but it's not adequate to face these kinds of indeterminacies. So these kinds of maybe, right? These kinds of qualities of this kind of the capacity to vary the expression that was already in your definition, right? Is really, really important. You need a lot of that.
Yeah, it seems like there might be a good case in there for the kind of things that is, so we have this like global network, we talk about globalism, but there's a lot of like top-down organizational planning in that. And there might be a good argument there for much more localized structures to be emerging instead of trying to like, you know, one area grows all the corn and then ships it around, you know, that might not be the best.
Right. That's a very good point. I mean, another thing that Giuseppe Longo, who's one of the two authors of these readings I'm giving you, has put it, a species that perfectly adapts to its niche goes extinct. It's this idea that, you know, in other words, if it's so perfectly fit, you know, and it doesn't have capacity to change, okay? This idea of you have a species with its capacities and you have a niche, and it's like a lock and key figure of thought, right? But that kind of figure, that kind of mechanical notion of best fit, right, is so brittle. There's no way to change without any kind of mechanism for adaptation. Not even in the next generation, but adaptation within the life of the organism, you know, has to be like moment to moment, right? Or, you know, day to day. If we don't have that, if we don't have the kind of ability, we will die and our species will die. So think about engineering, okay? So in engineering, just to, I'm elaborating what Tanya is saying here, you know, we have this big project, we need to build a dam, you know, hydroelectric dam here, let's say, do all these very, very precise measurements. And we build everything, you know, smart design, casting, 3D printing of steel, whatever you want, okay? But it's designed custom fit to just that situation, with that kind of rainfall, that amount of water use, blah, blah, blah. And then a hurricane comes by, or there's an earthquake, or the farmers all move out to the city, so they don't need so much water. Or maybe more people come in, so they need a lot more water, then maybe twice as much water. See, or war happens. So all that precisely done engineering breaks. Unless you have a way to, what would be the equivalent, right? You need to have a way to, like cyanogenes, a way to modulate the expression of raw materials into built structure. But just think about this. If we to really do that, it means what? You need to have cement factory, steel factory, suppliers ready to just adapt. That's not easy. You know, we don't build our systems like that so much. I mean, yes and no. I mean, some are, some parts are not, some parts aren't. Interesting. What other kinds of differences do we have between physical systems, according to them, physical systems and biological systems? I mean, you can, if you don't know the reading, you can conjecture some differences, and if you know the reading, you can go and poke at it right now. I would think, and look for some of those differences. I just keep going through this text myself and look for.
Checo mentioned the extended code, that they're in constant transition.
Yeah. Oh, here. Sorry, I'm going to put the links into the chat here. Okay. Yeah. Constant transition. Checo put this. Thank you. Checo, can you speak to that comment? What does it mean that they're in constant transition? Thanks, Cameron. Or somebody else too. I mean, you know, what does it mean to say that they're in constant transition?
So I think when they were talking about that, they talked about extended critical transition. It was hard to understand what they were talking about for a while, but I kind of started to piece it together as the like linking of the different levels of organization in the organism are constantly working together to build the organism, which kind of refers right back to what we were talking about last week.
I'm going to go to the pages where this occurs. Okay, in this more technical paper, it's called the inert versus the living state of matter. Okay, so let's go look around for it. So they look at, okay, in the previous page, say physical aspects are characteristic of exclusively physical systems, and then in this second column, they look at properties that are kind of moving toward the living state. And criticality is the word that occurs there, and I'll pick up on that in just a minute, okay? I'll come back to that. I think the plasticity is what we talked about earlier, the ability to adapt, And let's come back to criticality in just a minute, and I'll move on to the next page, where in 2.2.2 is where they get into the really interesting stuff about metabolic systems. Okay, so leave this on the second page here, but let me talk about criticality. Stop share. So I always love talking about this, but I never had the demo objects I really should have ready to hand. But, oh well, I don't have a ball. If it were in a physical classroom, I could just ask people around me if any of you have some props. But I'm in my daughter's room, which is very helpful because being a 10-year-old girl, she has lots of props. Okay, so here's something. It's sort of like a ball. Okay, let's just pretend it's a perfect sphere. Okay, if I were to put it on a flat table, it won't move anywhere. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Okay, but if I put it on top of a mountain, of course, it will roll down, right? And put it into a cup, it won't go anywhere either, right? So this is a good example of a physical system that has, in this case, if it's right on top of a peak or at the bottom of a valley, it's in what you would call critical point. Critical point is where things don't move. They're kind of locally stable, all right, for now. Okay, but look, if we're at the top of the peak, it's maybe it bounced perfectly like an egg, right? It's an unstable critical point, because if you just nudge it a little bit to one side or the other, it's going to fall away from this equilibrium position. If I put it in the bottom of a bowl, it also doesn't move, but it's in a stable critical point, because no matter how I nudge it, it's like those little dolls. It comes right back to where it was. So this is what's called stable critical point.
Right.
Now, physical systems, many physical systems, they may have critical points, but they're usually isolated, meaning there's no other critical point around them. Okay. There's a third kind of critical point, which is called metastable. And for that, I don't have, I'll ask you to imagine it. You know how a horse, if you put a saddle on a horse, what it looks like? You have, here's the neck of the horse, here's the tail, and right here in the middle is the saddle. Terrible. And I can put your two legs on either side of the saddle, right? So the curves concave down, all right? But from the mane to the rear of the horse, there's a curve that goes the other way. It's convex up. Terrible picture, right? So that middle point right there, if you go along the perpendicular to the spine of the horse, your legs on either side, right? It falls off. So if you were to just rock back and forth, left and right, you fall off the horse. But if you try to rock forward or back, it's in a local pit. So with respect to that direction, it's stable. If you rock forward or backward, you tend to come back to your upright position again. So that's a classic example. It's called a critical metastable point. Okay. All right. Now, I'm using these concrete figures just to give you something to imagine pictorially. Okay. This applies in very, very general situations. It could be, for example, you might have a bunch of blocks of ice, all piled up on one another. And if you just give a little nudge, the question is, well, they all fall apart, or they all sort of crumple together and stay put together or not. Or you might have a pot of water, and the water is heated slowly to boiling temperature, but it's not quite, there's no bubble, not too much bubbling yet, until you put in a crystal of salt, and then, right, it flashes into steam. You've done it, and you can do it at home, right? And also in the opposite direction, you can have water that's super cool, it gets cooler, but still liquid, until you drop just anything like a crystal, and bang, it freezes. Amazing. So these are called supercriticalities, where so these are all examples of criticalities. Now, complex systems theory talks about this kind of behavior in even more complicated situations. Right? When we have lots of species around the lake, and then you ask, well, is there some point where the water is okay? It's okay. It's okay. But at some point, there's an algae that starts to bloom, and then it goes run away. Right? So the lake tips over. It's called tipping point. Tips over from one condition where the water is kind of clear and animals and they can all maintain a certain kind of equilibrium, but it tips over into another situation where the algae just blossom like crazy, bloom like crazy, and it chokes off all the fish and everything goes dead. And this is another critical point. All right. So it could be either in this algae-laden form state, or it can be in the clear water state. And the questions that people ask, biologists and colleagues ask is, are there some middle points, transition points where we can maybe flip from one to the other? Okay. People are asking that right now about climate change. And now I think the climate science say we have about 7 or 8 major dimensions along which the Earth systems can tip over. And maybe 3 or 4 of them, 3 of them right now on the critical edge of tipping. So things like that. So the notion of criticality is very important. I'm taking a long time to discuss this in the physics side, all right? But now I go over to biology. Any questions so far on the physics side? It's clear? Amazing, through Zoom, huh? Okay, great. Biology. And this is really beautiful, actually, I think. What Giuseppe Longo and Maya Monteville in this altitude have been saying, observing. See, with animals, you could say that we're also critical because we're kind of fragile. I mean, I mean, as an animal, I mean, I have an accident or have a heart attack, God forbid, But the point is that yes, I'm alive now. I have this kind of autopoietic tendency to continue to be alive continuously, right? But it could be there may be certain conditions, like it might get really cold, I get caught outside the door, whatever, without my jacket in the middle of winter, where I might get to a critical point. Critical point meaning the integrity of my systems begins to fail, and the relationships among the processes no longer remain invariant, right? That's called dying in less jargony terms. But what's really cool, but amazing, is the following: is that they observe that living beings are beings that seem to have this kind of metastability, critical metastability, right? In other words, if things go in the wrong way, perturb in the wrong way, they'll die. But if you perturb in many other directions, they'll stay okay, right? So that's in a sense a way of describing mortality, or the possibility of dying is there. But because we're alive, we also have the possibility of staying alive. See what I'm saying? I'm trying to put into words what they describe mathematically about living beings. See, a rock is a rock is a rock is a rock. It just stays a rock. You see. But what's beautiful about living beings is that we could die, but we could also continue to be alive. That makes us really different from a rock, which can only persist in being a rock. It's beautiful. There's a mathematical way to describe this, which is this metastability. Okay. Right. Now there's more to it. I just said that I tend to continuously endure being alive. What does that say? That says that at any moment I'm in a critical, metastable critical point. Okay, I could die, I could stay alive, but more is that there's a continuum around this moment of state, momentary state, where in that region, I'm still in this condition of risk, right? So maybe my heart beats a little faster, I get a little hungrier, so my state has changed. But that state there, that nearby state there, in that nearby state, I'm still metastable. I'm still mortal. I'm still alive. So what that's saying is that that's what extended criticality is that this kind of criticality is not just at one point. This criticality is extended on a region of points. Okay. Is that okay? That's what extended criticality. I should say it's really extended metacriticality. I don't know. I mean, first time I said it this way ever. I mean, I've only looked at it on, in math forms, but talking to you is the first time I tried to do this in words. This is okay.
Well, isn't there also the emphasis of like that it's not that the space of criticality is extended, but also that the state of the organism is in constant transition between within that state.
It's always in motion, and it's true. Yes, Cameron. Our states are we're always evolving from state to state to state. Absolutely. And what's really amazing there, that's another thing that comes up is, well, you say moving, you usually think moving towards something or moving away from something. And that's where the old question about telos comes in again. It's not like we plan to, move to something normally. I mean, we can, once in a while we have a conscious decision, I want to pick up this cup, okay? But, at the millisecond by millisecond level, continuously, there's not that kind of telos. Yeah. Okay. I wonder, that's a very important property. Another one, I'll just share screen quickly so you can see where I'm looking. Here it is. Is probably one of the other really important notions is question of entropy and anti-entropy. Okay, I just want to flash this word so you can see what I'm looking at, anti-entropy, but I'll now talk about it verbally, okay? All right, so we don't have to read through the text together. You can do that. You should do that on your own. Entropy. Anybody want to take a stab at this word entropy? Anybody come across this word entropy before and have some idea of, at least colloquially, what people might mean by entropy? I can show you my daughter's room. That's an example. Oh, keep thinking. I'll come right back. Just a minute. So I'll show you an example. Oh wait, I should take out blur. This is pretty fun. I take out blur. Hang on. Okay, sure. I probably shouldn't do this because we're expecting some guests soon. But right now, I'll show you. Actually, my wife tells me don't do this because it reduces the respect for the professor to reveal that he's actually zooming from his daughter's bedroom. Okay, so don't tell people. Anyway, so right now she's not here. So everything, it looks like this. This is where her toys are.
Right.
This is called order.
Right.
And so all her toys are here. And within, I would say, 20 minutes after she gets here, it's really literally like that. And the more she's here, the more things get distributed all over the floor, literally all over the floor. I mean, really, it's really amazing how fast it happens. Okay. Entropy is a degree of disorder when things are scattered across the floor. So it's the opposite of order. Okay. And this happens also even without 10-year-old kids playing with toys. This is what happens in nature with any kind of dynamical process that tends to subject to thermodynamics. Basically, right, people usually talk about examples like a pile of sand, right? Have a pile of sand, and then we add energy to the system, like jiggle, the board on which the sand is being placed, or wind blows, it will then flatten out. right? And the sand particles will become more and more widely distributed across bigger and bigger areas, right? It happens also with the universe in which we're sitting, okay, et cetera, et cetera. But then look at our societies. We don't have just a uniform mass of buildings and cars and things. I mean, not randomly distributed, just jumbled and stuff. There's concentrations, right? There's Rome, Paris, Milan, Phoenix. There are concentrations with highly ordered structures, roads, shopping malls, you know. So it's amazing, right? And also just not just humans, right? Shells, look at shells. Or, you know, birds' nests, beehives. So there's been a conjecture from early 20th century scientists, I think it was Schrodinger, oh no, Haldane, a physicist, who kind of
it was Schroeder.
Was it Schrodinger?
Mhm.
Oh, okay. So what's the thing that he was saying about life?
He essentially defined life as an anti-entropic force. That it was able to take entropy or essentially produce entropy in its environment while localizing anti-entropy. That's how he defined it.
Using order or anti-entropy. And in fact, he was made a kind of a definition that life is those kinds of systems, material, physical systems that actually locally at least reduce entropy. And why is this so important? It's because in physics, from thermodynamics, it's a law of physics that any dynamical system that anytime energy is being transformed in some way, like I just poured toys onto the floor, right? They created noise and actually created heat too, because it added some vibrations to the floor, which then gets dissipated as heat. So some of that mechanical energy gets transformed into a kind of energy heat or noise that goes into the walls that is irrecoverable. I cannot use that energy anymore. It's just gone. Okay, I can't recover that to then maybe turn the door or open the door or whatever. In thermodynamics, any kind of transformation always has some non-zero quantity of energy that gets transformed into heat. This is the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, and there are ways to derive that law from basic statistical physics. Okay, which we don't go into here. So that's what makes it's a universal, in other words, but physical law. But that's what makes Schrodinger's characterization of life so powerful, because we are going against the law of physics, the universal law of physics. And I think Cameron mentioned that just the kind of loophole is that we do it by bringing energy in.
Yeah, we're injecting energy into the system.
Yeah.
That's what's decreasing. Yeah.
And sorry, the other part was exporting disorder. That the Cameron mentioned, and exporting disorder. That we increase disorder in the universe as a whole, but locally we increase order. This is the law of thermodynamics. This is really important, I think, for our course, because sometimes I don't know, not amazed, it's not the right word. I don't know what you call it, taken aback, agog, something, when I think about a lot of designers, let's say, or system designers, who think about designing this or that big infrastructure and thinking of committing billions of dollars worth of capital for something to increase order, right? To build some sort of structure without thinking about thermodynamics, even at this large scale. You see what I'm saying? Because you say, if we put in so much effort to build order here, even on just very general grounds, it will result in exporting disorder out into the rest of the universe. Somewhere, somebody, something has to pay the cost. Okay. Just thinking that way, you know, incorporating that kind of thinking, thermodynamic thinking, into design, I think would yield a completely different way of thinking about design. Right? If we always, it's not just the life cycle cost of a product. Because if you think about life cycle cost of a battery or car, it's still not thinking about the amount of disorder outside the whole cycle, in the rest of the universe. There's always going to be that cost. Okay. Even if you can't measure it in terms of dollars, it's still a cost in terms of disorder.
It's
I'm
really
expressing
interesting
this.
to I was just going to say it's really interesting to look at like fossil fuel burning and stuff, right? There's a highly concentrated energy source that we then burn to, which increases we create entropy in the process through the burning, but we're able to transfer that organization to build things like or to do things, to do work, to build buildings. But on the whole, we're kind of increasing the entropy of the earth.
It's a wonderful observation. Giliki, did you want to say?
Yeah. I was just going to talk about how, in general, I think essentially the world that we're in today is, I don't know, I feel like we're reaping the fruits of, the entropy we've created, like, with Cameron's point on like fossil fuel burning. The world as it is today, especially like in developed countries, these countries have arrived at where they are because they've utilized fossil fuels. Like it is beneficial, right? They have like industrialized countries. There is development, right? There was development, and in many ways, even in many parts of the world, fossil fuels still drive development. But like you said, there is a cost, and now we're having to ask ourselves if the so-called economic benefits are worth the cost to the environment. And then I think that while it can seem very straightforward to say, oh, just stop burning fossil fuels, I don't think it's that simple because, again, development in general comes at a cost. So there's a question to ask to say, do certain regions of the world continue using fossil fuels to get to a point where they don't have to use fossil fuels? Or do we all come together and say, oh, let's not all use fossil fuels? So I think all this is just pointing out about how like a lot of things are not so straightforward. So at the end of the day, someone's going to pay. The question is who, or something's going to pay.
Yeah, I agree with that so strongly. I think that the externalized costs where other people are paying those costs is kind of one of the like paradigms of capitalism, right? The people earning the benefit, the economic benefit is being accrued in one place and the costs are being paid elsewhere.
Yeah. This thing about external, Tanya just mentioned the word external, right? And this is a problem with conceptual problem with systems, thinking of the world in terms of systems. Because I don't know about you, but I think me and probably normally, when people say system, people usually think of it as a bounded system. There's something inside that system, and there's other stuff that's not in the system, right? So there's a notion of inside, outside. Of course, when we talk about infrastructure, that's why I'm talking about infrastructure for this course. It's a different sense, right? If we think of infrastructure as being somehow woven throughout life, right? System has this notion of internal, external, or if it's economics, has this notion of exogenous, right? Endogenous and exogenous factors in an economy. And that allows us to think about, if some elements or factors leave the system, is no longer within scope of concern. Okay. So yes, absolutely, for capitalism or for colonial powers too, right? Degree of chaos. I was curious. Before we move forward, Leah, did you want to say a little bit about what you're thinking about in terms of degree of chaos? Is a way of thinking about.
Yeah, I was just answering the entropy question early on. I feel like we've moved past it, but I do have a question or a thought. Like I think, well, now that we're talking about creating like order in one place, kind of creating disorder in another, like infinite examples are coming to mind now. But then, with that, like if we think about trying to design systems in a different way that accounts for this kind of like exchange of chaos almost, like how, I can't wrap my mind around how you would even consider that in a design, for instance, you know? So if you're like, I don't know, the example that I'm thinking about right now is like allocation of resources in like a city budget, you know, like if you allocate and try to order really strictly in one place, it's going to result in like underfunding in another. And like I can't wrap my mind around like accounting for entropy and anti-entropy in like a system design. And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe we're going to work up to that. But
oh, we are working up to that. And that
yeah.
actually, it's not too early. It's not too early to raise the question, really. I mean, just as you're speaking, Leah, I'm thinking, oh yeah, let's think about that. What would it mean in terms of bureaucracy? You know, having lived and worked inside bureaucracies for most of my career, have a nice allergic reaction to them. So I'm always thinking about other ways to introduce a bit more flexibility. So for example, metastability. If we say that it's good for, I mean, it's natural for an organism to remain in a metastable state, and then even after perturbation, it still is in a metastable state. See, what would that mean? That means that we don't think of organisms don't live in such a way that they become stable. Because if they land in a stable state, they're no longer able to evolve, to adapt. They will die. As soon as the environment changes, they will die. Okay. So what about then we can think, okay, what about organizations? What about bureaucracies? What I don't know yet. Okay, I'm just asking the question. What would it mean to set up a organization such that every decision maker, every person who is responsible for allocation of resources, etc., or every subunit or every organism there is equipped, prepared, powered to remain in this metastable condition. Can respond stably to certain kinds of most kinds of perturbations. Yeah, but when opportunities emerge, then it must be able to change its operations. Think about it. I mean, we can think about it. I mean, just from practical things, I know, for example, that we hire people for a job is have a job spec. And one way to look for new staff or faculty is to come up with a spec for that job that you have now identified as a need in your organization. You post it and with a very long list of spec, and then you may or may not get the right people for that job. You might get, a couple of people who formally fit those criteria, and you hire them in, they do just that criteria, and then it doesn't really work very well. Or you post a job saying we are looking for, and then post fewer constraints. And so I want people who are whatever, reliable, whatever you want to say, but don't have a long list of degrees or skills and da da da. And then people come, and then you grow them inside the organization. You mentor them, you give them projects, they do okay here, they don't do so okay there, so maybe they get moved over to a different set of relationships and jobs than they had originally been hired into, and then over a couple of years they become really good, as a fit inside the ecosystem of the company. Big mature companies do this, so they have the resources to be able to sustain that kind of internal growth. And certain kinds of organizations are really good at being open in terms of admission and things like that. So I don't know, that might be the beginning of a country place to think about this kind of thing. Yeah. Like noise, right? A bit of noise may actually be quite helpful to have instead of perfect fit, which is like a stable equilibrium. What do you say? We have time for maybe one more point here. And thanks, Cameron put in a link to this article on early warning signals for critical transitions, which is really, really interesting. And I think it's worth adding to our readings, okay? Last thing I'll say is about time. It's about time. And a colleague of mine in the synthesis network, Wendy, who's in Washington, University of Washington, and I are going to do a workshop on measure and value in the Society for Literature, Science, and the Arts conference in October. It's coming to ASU. It'll be at ASU October 25 to 29, something like that. So I'm hoping that you all will have a chance to look at the link. I'll send it out. And during that conference, we'll do a little workshop on measure and time, measure, and value. And part of the idea is, part of the proposition is, you know, can we think about time other than the way clocks measure time or calendars? I mean, it's on a mathematical matrix, you know, tick, tick, tick. Because think about it, before machines, and even before, you know, modern industrial society, there was a pulse of life, you know, the seasons, the turn of the day, puberty, birth, death. Definitely there was passage and transition, but no clocks, not according to a clock. Okay. So, but so much of our economy is really pinned to this kind of mathematical notion of time. But that's really divorced from biological time and divorced from even cosmological time. So one of our little workshops is about what would happen if you take some of our, let's say, social technical infrastructures and rethink them. So for example, thinking about finance. Right now, thinking about principal and interest-bearing savings deposits or whatever, they're based on calendar time. Or if you get a student loan, you have a certain number of years to pay it off at a certain interest rate based on a clock. And it's pretty awkward. You know, you can apply for what is it called, forbearance, you know, if you need to for whatever reasons, but that's pretty bureaucratically horrendous to do, right? I don't know if any of you had a force to do that, but I know people who have. But what if instead the time it takes to pay off a student loan is clocked by life events, like if you have a child, if you don't have a child, if you go for a school, it doesn't matter when you go to a graduate school, but that you go to graduate school, bang, you know, clocks resets differently. Or you may or may not get married or whatever, you know, any kind of life changes, then would automatically, it would be timed to life changes instead of to calendar, for example. You know? And then other kinds of time too, other kinds of, we call them analog time. Okay, I'll leave that with you. All right. Any last points you want to raise? Anybody want to raise for us to look at? Okay. Well, I hope that was fun. That was fun. It's fun for me. And I guess that means next week, I'll wait to see your responses. And I guess next week we'll see more, some pictures and videos of the work that we've been doing at Synthesis Center. Okay.
I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm too eager to show them. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. See you. Take care.